So, welcome to this episode of Unmute, and what a pleasure to have with us today Professor Navdeep Mathur. Professor Navdeep Mathur is at the moment Associate Professor at IIM Ahmedabad in the arena of public policy and part of the Public Systems Group. But he has a long academic exercise and domain where he studied at the Hull, the Rutgers, and then worked in Birmingham. Of course, I have Minar, my co-host and companion, who are doing this together. And, I also want to say that Professor Navdeep Mathur is a go-to person when it comes to civic space and civic society and questions of public policy. We consult him, and he's always sort of giving his time. And whenever we call him, Professor, we want to crack this, give us time, and he's always there. So thank you once again, Professor, for coming and being with us on this show of Unmute, where we think a lot of things need to be unmuted today. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah. Would you like to say something more about yourself?
It's really nice to be here. Thank you so much. And this is an interesting conversation that I understand that we are going to be having. These are very important questions that you talked about in terms of the space. What is public systems? What is public policy? And I think look forward to that conversation.
Yeah, and therefore I go back to my first question, starting point. Your first experiences, as you said, in Birmingham. You were studying this triology of civic, market and state, and how they converge to look at public policy formulation. Do you think it really works? The issues of accountability. Do you think there are some lessons to be learned for India in this whole, because we are also going there slowly. What would be your imagination and thoughts on that?
So a kind of a little brief on the background of looking at collaborative governance. The idea that governance is no longer the domain, and for a long time has no longer been the domain of governmental institutions alone. And when what we call the period in which the state started hollowing out in the 1980s in the UK, in the US, where other institutions, markets, and civic organizations, not-for-profit organizations were engaged in the process of policy formulation and public policy delivery. So it had been a process where the state had been offloading a lot of public services to other organizations that were not formally part of government. So there are a lot of concerns that arose about whether these organizations, for whatever good that they offered to delivering public services, are they going to be subject to the same norms of transparency? Would they be subject to norms of accountability that state institutions would? Would they be publicly accountable for what they do in the public sphere? And that's the background of trying to interrogate and scrutinize this space which is called collaborative governance. The questions were that since there's no statutory mandate and statutory jurisdiction within which they deliver or engage with public services, how does the public regulate them? In the UK, there were a bunch of whole scheme of regulation that came across. There was these things called quangos. There was a lot of different kinds of organization that came up under this hollowing out. This process in India, let me start with something that one part of that came to India first, which was called public-private partnerships. Not so much in the civic sector initially, but they came in the field of infrastructure development. Yes. Because the idea was that governmental institutions, governmental organizations do not do efficiently, or are they not technologically proficient in creating infrastructure, and that needs to be conducted by institutions that work outside the government. Private sector organizations, as well as they're governed by the rules of the marketplace and not the rules of statutory work. Public-private partnerships, as we know, had this outlay of making civic infrastructure, public infrastructure, including private infrastructure, if you call airports and roads and a whole lot of other things, bridges and things like this, what is commonly called construction activities. Yeah. Eventually, these organizations also worked in the area of health. There were public-private partnerships in healthcare, and broadly, it was also a process where government started offloading more and more of public service work to mostly private organizations. Eventually, of course, organizations which we call the not-for-profit sector, voluntary organizations that already used to fill gaps prior to this kind of a public-private sector, rise of this partnership sort of approach, already filled gaps where the government was unable to reach, started also then engaging with the government in delivering public services. Right. Yeah. Because of last mile delivery issues, because of reach, because of depth, government institutions failed to even earlier have institutions that would allow work at the grassroots, where as far as India goes, much of the population is far away and distant from the spaces where governmental institutions actually function. And I think that's sort of key. The question that you asked, whether they have been able to, these organizations, this idea of collaborative governance, whether they have actually been able to breach that vast gap between places where policies are formulated and where they are supposed to be delivered, and to the people who actually need it, which is much of India, which is many of these areas are extremely remote, and remote not just in terms of distance and space, but also in terms of the sort of connection between their franchise as citizens and the institutions which are beholden, which are their sort of custodians of their rights and resources. And it's still a good question. The organizations that used to work quite well at the grassroots, that were participatory in nature, may have continued to do so, may have done very good work because of their long history of grassroots work, because of their long history of participatory work. But many of the newer institutions that were modeled more on corporate lines, that were modeled on lines of what was considered private sector efficiency, may be still lacking in delivering services in a way that is meaningful.
But Navdeep, I want to sorry if I call you Navdeep,
no, please,
but
please.
The word you will use is partnership.
Yes.
But the terms are that of a contractor.
Right.
And that changes the dynamics of almost subservience of the civil society organization, who then became NGOs.
Right.
So from civil society, they became NGOs because they were subcontractors. Therefore, instead of influencing public policy, they just started following the orders of the state. And therefore, the accountability question was that government was no longer listening. And as civil society couldn't sort of put their space as equals, rather than that they became scale and service delivery boys. Why do you think that has happened everywhere, or it is specific to India?
Well, in India, of course, the historical sort of subject position of government has been of sarkar, right? Which is more like lordship than it is of serving the public historically. But that doesn't mean that in other places that's also not the case. Government does have resources. The organizations that work in the public service field are beholden to some of these resources. If they don't have them from the government, they have them from other organizations to which they do become beholden. And as a consequence of that, it depends on the kind of organization from where they secure funding, which is also regulated in many ways by the government, that these outcomes are what they are. In some ways, many of these organizations don't have such a sway over public policy. They have much less of a sway than of market-based institutions. And as a consequence of this, as a consequence of private sector organizations having sort of captured policy advice in India, as opposed to, in earlier when there were a whole different sorts of institutions of policy advice. There were committees, there was grassroots organizations, there were all sorts of organizations that could influence public policy, that could influence, that could have, they were seen as legitimate places where advocacy for public welfare and public service could be found, which is much less the case now. Large corporate houses have been engaged in shaping, for example, educational policies in India, shaping health policies in India. Information technology companies have been singularly responsible for shaping quite often urban development and urban transportation policies in India for their own needs of the kind of employees they need, the kind of spaces they need to work, the kind of networks and infrastructure they need. So I don't think that in this kind of a very skewed distribution of I just don't want to call it corporate power, because that's one way. But resources which weigh on policy, it is skewed in this way, that civil society organizations that work at the grassroots have as much say as these other organizations.
And do you subscribe that the structural shift from the Planning Commission to NITI Aayog actually reflects that shift from Planning Commission actually allocating resources to NITI Aayog only a consulting outfit?
Right. I think that's one of the most stark, visible representations you can see of this shift, where the Planning Commission itself was an accountable statutory organization to an organization which doesn't seem to have any kind of statutory accountability, or creates budgets for expenditure on public goals, which the Planning Commission's sole responsibility was. The Planning Commission also had several, in the last few editions of the Planning Commission, these papers on the needs of the different sectors in India. Yeah. What was lacking in those sectors? There was a lot of data that was collected. There was a lot of consultation that was carried out, that was put to public debate, put to challenge, and formulated in a way that was much, much more transparent, much more open, much more responsive to the research that was done in order to create a planning document, in order to create a 5-year plan, in order to create sub-parts of that 5-year plan for different sectors. That's clearly something that doesn't happen now. And you might ask, where has it gone? Now that's the interesting bit. If it has gone to areas where the private sector, which has, which may not be open to the right to information, which may not have as much public transparency, if that's where it has gone, then we have a lot less idea about whose needs are being served at all, whose needs are being met by the kind of consulting work that the NITI Aayog is doing, who are their primary clients. If the regular public, the general public is their primary client, we don't see the forums that would demonstrate that to be the case. What we see is forums of the NITI Aayog where, again, business associations seem to be their primary clients, where policies are designed, where projects are designed, keeping in mind the aims and goals of private sector organizations. And one of the more recent examples is of this, what used to be, at least till very recently, called smart cityfication of Indian cities, which the NITI Aayog was also quite, principally involved in. And the idea was that smart cities, all the reasons why they were spelled out it was unclear what this would do for regular citizens who have continued to suffer a crisis of housing, a crisis of sanitation, a crisis of healthcare, all the basic services, a crisis of access to clean drinking water. It's unclear what these large mega projects labeled in this way have done besides sort of fulfilling the business strategies of IT corporations, of other kinds of data collection, surveillance infrastructures that are in the cities. The questions are being asked by people whether these are for policing and control or they are for serving the public. So that's something that one can see this shift very tangibly in these areas.
But there's also the shift from cooperative federalism to competitive federalism. Those who perform better get more, rather than those who need more get more. And is that part of the global shift?
This idea of competitive federalism, so in our earlier work on collaborative governance, as I was mentioning, we looked at 3 types of discourses that affect the way in which partnerships function: the club, the polity, and the agency model. And it was the agency model that came out to be the strongest, that where these individual units, partnerships were judged on the basis of performance. Now the performance indicators are set by whether it's the government, but they are kind of market indicators for performance, right? And in the kind of shift in discourse around performance came to an extent where performative work became more important. So states would, try and create these results that were performative rather than actually delivering in order to get the funding. And the logic was that you get funding, and therefore, so those who were in need, who were not able to perform because they lacked capacity, they had all sorts of other things to create these performance wouldn't get it. Yeah.
So now I want to build on your response on the smart cities and the way you have outlined the kind of evolution and how it links to the capture of the public policy by particular interest groups within the country. So you've done a lot of studies on the urban studies in relation to Ahmedabad in terms of riverfront development and the resettlement. I also bring in from my earlier work with organizations such as you in terms of the urban displacement and what kinds of policy implications it has. So from your work on the whole resettlement issues and looking at this whole kind of a development which has been pushed on cities, and that is seen across the country, not only in case of Ahmedabad, are there any general kind of policy principles that you think would be useful to be articulated, to be culled out, which would be useful for urban activists, urban organizations, urban civic groups in that perspective?
Right. Let me begin by talking about that experience and sort of the learning from that experience first, so that there has been no development of state capacity to deal with this issue of displacement. And it's not so much a matter of only resources. It's simply not the concern of the government. These people who get displaced for the state don't seem to matter. They're also highly, the way in which the jurisdictions are, they're highly fragmented. They're not a significant voting population. That aside, the capacity to do development projects that actually bring development and growth to the very populations that are marginalized isn't part of the reason why these projects are designed in the first place. These projects are designed like the riverfront and like these other projects that have displaced people. They displaced millions of people over time, but hundreds of thousands in any cities. They are elite projects. They are projects that are conducted for leisure spaces, for real estate growth and development. Who will be the participants in that benefit? Would be people who have significant ownership of resources, wealthy people. It's clearing out the city for that kind of. So they don't have this thing they don't have this idea that we should have capacity developed in order to deal with this. Had that been the case, Today we would have been, after 20 years after, more than 20, 30 years almost after the Sabarmati project was conceptualized and passed by the Municipal Corporation of Ahmedabad, we should have had an entire department to deal with rehabilitation, to deal with resettlement, to deal with livelihood development, all of these things. These are all left out to the market. And by saying that, it's basically the burdens of it up on the bodies of the human beings who suffer the consequences of displacement. That's what it really means. So they become cheap, disposable labor for factories and industries that are supposed to be attracted now by this new looking city that is supposed to promote economic growth. So that this capacity is outsourced, right? And that outsourcing doesn't actually go to any particular individual, it goes to this mechanism which makes the lives of people much worse than it was at the time where they had come to some level of economic stability. What lessons do, I mean, there have been a lot of social movements, there have been a lot of groups that organize around rehabilitation and around the right to stay put as well. You know this better from your experiences worldwide and Mumbai and several places. But I think there's always a tussle between this structural argument that government has to reshape policy, that instead of doing these kinds of projects that are top-down, that are anti-poor, that there should be projects that basically include everybody and the benefits are very directly distributed through the project to the displaced communities, to the people who are going to suffer the consequences, and to rehabilitation elsewhere. So this idea that rehabilitation would help elsewhere and we'll help facilitate it, I think creates a lot of conflict. Several NGOs in Ahmedabad have helped the displacement of people, have allowed this sort of marginalization to fester, to continue. And this basically says that, you know, the organizations that are not very strong but have strong structural grounds for their resistance, for their dissent, lose out. And those who are more like government contractors, as Gagan bhai pointed out, they kind of win. They win the contract to help people settle there and, you know, do little bits of relief work in the first few months or something in some housing area far away from the city center. So it looks like the government is doing something and grassroots folks are involved in that. So it looks like it's fine. But, you know, after 7 or 8 years, the place is shambles. People are in horrendous conditions all over again. Those buildings are unlivable. It's nobody's responsibility anymore.
Yeah.
So we are back to a situation where this is what is enabled by the fact that the government doesn't have capacity, it doesn't build capacity. And neither do the organizations, the NGOs who are involved in this, have that kind of capacity. They have some other goals for which the resources are spent. So, yeah.
No, so as a follow-up, again linking with your first response, that the social policy is then acting or in the interests of particular groups, and the benefits of those are in a way captured by particular groups at the cost of, rather at the loss of, the number of people who should have been considered stakeholders in the public policy. Is that a right way of putting what you're saying?
That is what it is. I would say social policy is subservient to infrastructure policy, for example. Right? It's an afterthought. It's a thought. If at all we call it social policy, then it's an afterthought, and it actually comes on the backs of the struggle of people. Public interest litigations are filed. Till then, there is no such thing as social policy. Right? It's infrastructure policy first, and then the fallout is dealt with in this way by the organizations that mobilize people, that work with them and do various things to bring up the thing. But the first principle that Michael Chernia, in years ago, even around the time that the Narmada Dam conflicts were going on, spelled out a model, spelled out a logic of reconstruction, and looked at several principles in that what's lost is not just this space that people are living in, but community ties, security, education, services that need to be replaced, which are not part of the calculus, even now, of most government projects, right? And that's something that's been in the environment, been in circulation for so long. And one rarely sees civic organizations, not-for-profit civil society organizations, organizing on those lines, And I think that's one of the things that one can take strongly away from.
My experience in Mumbai, working on the whole issue of the linking roads and the displacement caused by linking roads, is pretty much aligned. That if the people don't mobilize and people don't actually push for particular alternatives that they are looking at, and that it's the continuum, even in the United Nations they define the continuum of any displacement to development, rather than, if not displacement, to worsening situation. So you should actually be in a better off situation than what you were in your original place. That is the core principle that is lost. So what happens is you get into more worse situation in the resettlement than where you were originally. So that's pretty much aligned to what my experiences have been.
But therefore vulnerability is increasing.
Right.
Is that what your data says?
Yeah.
That the different kinds of vulnerability happening in urban spaces, or is the other part really which you said? Therefore, cities are not for the poor. They are just to service the infrastructure and the rich. Is that why more migration or migrant labor comes in? Is there some pattern there?
The pattern is not entirely new, but it's definitely intensified over the last 15, 20 years. The pattern that rural displacement led to migration to cities, and therefore the settling of cities happened on the backs of rural displacees. I think 60 million was the figure till the time around the year 2000, and then that intensified over the last 20-25 years. Urban vulnerability has definitely increased. There's also a very sharp segregation within cities now. So these displacement inside the cities make sure that poor people, working people, are moved further away from the areas of the city which have better services, which have better quality of housing, which have all the amenities that people in cities need. So by and large, this peripheralization of the poor, both in terms of economic resources as well as in the imagination of the city, has intensified definitely over time. And they only brought in they brought in to sort of do construction work, they brought in for service work. The transportation is also set up in a similar way. There's better transportation for office workers and service class workers who are better off economically, and much worse and much more time consuming to bastis and places where the working people live. Yeah.
And therefore, moving to the other part, therefore the masculine wins.
Right. Yeah.
The way of looking at development, and you've been doing a lot of work on feminist discourse,
Right.
Feminist evaluation.
Right.
We have been together in some feminist organization. How do you therefore see this feminist and the feminist movement is built?
Right.
Is it in any way influencing discourse, especially in the corporate sector? Because if the policy is being more conditioned by them, and they see this, the need for the feminine within the corporate sector, just not more women, but the feminist way of collective consultation.
Right.
Is that happening in the corporate sector? And therefore, will there be hope from that side?
If you look at the boards of the top 100 companies in India, you'll find that a lot of them violate the mandate for women directors. Still, very minuscule number of companies will adhere to the actual norms. So we have a problem there for sure. But the larger question of whether the discursive formation of a feminist outlook, which is basically an gender egalitarian outlook, has it somehow been institutionalized in corporate in companies and corporates. From at least the data that I've seen and the conversations I've had over the last 15 years with these groups, not just of women, but both men, women, queer folk who are in companies, that the marginalization exists. It exists in different ways. It's less open. These spaces are hegemonically still extremely patriarchal. There are many women in positions of leadership, no doubt, and many more women in positions of leadership than there have been earlier. There's more openness to people who are queer than before. Much of it has happened because of foreign firms and the environment that foreign firms bring, not necessarily because anything is changing in the Indian context. Right? So some, whether it's American firms or British firms, because of the culture that they bring, cultures of egalitarianism to some extent. It's not that they're perfect, but they have their own problems. And but the way in which their DEI functions on paper is definitely a huge step up from what organizations here have been able to offer. So there is some space, there is some change, but yeah.
DEI mean diversity, equity, inclusion, and very important in public policy. Go ahead.
Yeah. So that's the long and short of it. But
some
I think
positive, hopeful examples you have in all the research you have done. Any company or any such kind of process.
No, there are numerous examples. I mean, identifying them is going to be difficult outright. There's a lot of latitude. What I hear again is companies that the international consulting companies or international product companies, they are better places for women and non-binary folks to work in than Indian companies, is what I've heard quite a lot. And many of the papers that I've seen on sexual harassment, gender, the feminist evaluation work quite often looks at sexual harassment, that the kind of norms there are around sexual harassment are much poorer. So even though we have internal complaint, we have the POSH Act, Internal Complaints Committee, it works much better in companies that are subsidiaries of international firms. That's what the sense that I have got so far in the cases that I have read, in the papers, the research that I have come across, as well as the conversations I have with former students from my institute that have gone to these companies and worked. I've heard some horror stories from many places, but the good, as you're saying, the good things that I've heard, the cases where things have been dealt with extremely well, have been international companies with offices here, where they've actually set in norms for safety, for all sorts of things, at many levels, not just in terms of sexual harassment, in terms of night shifts, in terms of weekends, in terms of protecting time from balance of work, all of these things. That's what I've heard so far.
Just continuing on this, in terms of looking at the whole CSR issue, and when you look at the corporate sector and the way the CSR is practiced at present, is that something which serves public purpose from your perspective, or is it more public relations done in a kind of a charity mode, where some of these issues that you are raising, whether it is the issues in relation to gender equality and those kinds of things, are not part of those concerns, or not they're not being looked at from the perspective of empowering the community, then making community the stakeholder, or community having an agency in the change process. What's your take on those whole CSR kind of a framework that is being mandated at this point of time?
Maybe I'll add to it, and then you can comprehensively. I'm working on this. What are the good public arguments of why the corporates should invest in rule of law for their own sake, not as charity? Is that a mindset which is in any way having a seed, or it's not even considered?
I haven't come across that as a very serious discussion as yet, at least. I know that internally some companies do have conversations, and petitions are, circulated amongst employees with fear of some reprisal regarding acts of public violence, social violence, things like this that people are concerned about, employees are concerned about. At a company, at an administrative level, I have not really come across this. In fact, I've come across cases where people who talk about public issues openly are reprimanded by their HR managers or something like this. That can't engage in politics, can't. So anything that is not related to some immediate concern of the company is treated as politics. So even the idea of law and order, public value, constitutional rights issues, they're considered as politics. So you're not supposed to do that from any kind of a platform that shows that you're from this company. But CSR is an interesting question, of course. There may be many companies who are partnering and taking an approach that is more participatory. And I have heard of, some companies do that. That the approach they take is grassroots oriented. They work for a long duration with not-for-profit or civil society groups that have been working at the grassroots. They see that their funds are used for some kind of democratic education, democratic empowerment. It's not that that's not the case. But of course, the broader critique of CSR, which has been placed very well, I mean, if you've seen Anand Girdhar Das's book and the cases there and the ones that follow, many firms use CSR for their brand development, for their brand extension, for deepening their own markets for products that they have, for cross, sale of things that their products, and so it's. I mean, let's say that they were seriously invested in CSR as social responsibility to do with, the questions that we can ask, and maybe some economist is better placed to answer this. Have wages increased in real terms? Have people's housing conditions improved? Have their access to good quality air and water improved? I mean, if we answer these basic questions, we can then see if there are any effects of CSR. Otherwise, adopting a school here, adopting 20 schools somewhere, doing tree plantation exercises, and several versions of these things that we might think are trivial are what are commonly seen. School kids have come and said that this company that is making this wonderful product, came to our school and did this. And we know that they're one of the biggest polluters, and there are several criminal cases against them in environmental pollution of a lake or a river or something like this. And so it's very hard to square off these sorts of things.
Case by case situations and
well, that's one. Yeah. That's certainly one. But I would say that broadly, if you look at worsening inequality in India and worsening quality of life of people who live in urban settlements in any city, one can clearly make the claim that in general it doesn't work, and neither is it aimed to.
I believe there is I'm not very accurate with the data, but almost 50,000 crores worth of CSR spent in India and on the increase.
Right.